So this is our mini lecture on the European Enlightenment. So what was the Enlightenment? Well, broadly speaking, the Enlightenment was an intellectual movement occurring mostly in the 18th century in Europe, which challenged traditional ways of thinking about the natural world and human societies. For a long time, European scholars and academics had maintained that the ultimate source of wisdom and knowledge was divine revelation. But the thinkers associated with the Enlightenment emphasized the role of reason and factual observation in learning about the world and about human beings. Although the Enlightenment is most often associated with the 18th century, its roots go much further back than that. In the 15th and 16th centuries, Europe was undergoing something called the Renaissance. Now, the Renaissance is a French word that literally means rebirth. So basically, the Renaissance involved the rediscovery of ancient texts and ideas, including from a lot of old scholarly masters of the Greco-Roman period, like Socrates, Aristotle, Plato, Archimedes, Pliny, etc., who were rediscovered and translated during this period. And the knowledge base provided by these old world scholarly masters became the foundation for much later research and writing during the Renaissance period, and then, as we'll see, subsequently during the Enlightenment period. Then, in the 16th and 17th centuries, Europe went through something called the Scientific Revolution. Scientific Revolution was another intellectual movement that challenged traditional understandings of the natural world. One of those traditional ideas was the ancient view of an Earth-centered universe. For a long, long time, people believed that the Earth, being God's preeminent creation, was naturally at the center of the universe, and the sun, the moon, the stars, and all the heavenly bodies revolved around the Earth. This theory was eventually debunked and replaced by Nicholas Copernicus's seminal book on the revolutions of the celestial spheres, in which he posited the theory of a heliocentric or sun-centered universe. Another driving force behind the scientific revolution, and this guy is really kind of a transitional figure between the scientific revolution and then later the Enlightenment, and his name is Sir Isaac Newton. In Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, Isaac Newton set forth his ideas on gravity, which proved foundational to modern science. Newton was influential on subsequent thinkers of the Enlightenment because he depicted a rationally ordered universe moving in accordance with natural laws that could be grasped by human reason and explained by mathematics. Probably the three most famous of those natural laws that Newton discovered were his three laws of motion. Those of you who've had a physics class, you are probably familiar with these already. First law is basically every object in a state of motion tends to remain in that state of motion unless an external force, like, say, gravity, is applied to it. Second law, the relationship between an object's mass and its acceleration. And the applied force is F equals force, F or force equals mass times acceleration. And then the third law, for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction, which are still foundational principles of modern physics. Okay. Newton's argument that natural laws governed all things, and that those laws could be learned through observation and reason, became a foundational tenet of the European Enlightenment of the following century, the 18th century. In the 18th century, hundreds of European scholars from all disciplines in many countries attempted to apply that belief to their own research. Although the Enlightenment was present in nearly every European country, it was particularly strong in certain centers of intellectual activity, three of which in particular I would point out. One is France. In France, two of the major figures of the Enlightenment were Voltaire and Rousseau. Um, Voltaire was a playwright, novelist, and a philosophe. The French word philosophe basically means philosopher or public intellectual. Um, and Voltaire is one of those really interesting figures. Had a very wide-ranging, well-traveled, and controversial life. Loved to feud with all of the other major Enlightenment thinkers of his day, including Rousseau. He lived all over Europe. For example, for a time, he lived as the personal house guest of King Frederick the Great of Prussia. Probably his most famous work is Candide, a philosophical novel that satirizes the philosophical optimism of the German philosopher Gottfried Leibniz. Um, and it was also, by the way, banned for heresy in several European countries. Um, then there's Rousseau. Rousseau is another polymath, both an accomplished novelist and musical composer, as well as a truly groundbreaking political theorist. Rousseau originated the idea of the social contract. Social contract theory is basically the idea that civilization begins as a contract in which people agree to surrender some of their liberty and submit to the authority of the ruler or the state um, in exchange for protection for themselves and for their remaining freedoms. And one thing that Voltaire and Rousseau both had in common, um, they were both fierce critics of organized religion. They both loved to satirize and lampoon the Catholic Church, which of course was the established church in their home country of France. Then there's England. In England, the major figures of the European Enlightenment were Newton, as I mentioned before, and also this guy down here on the bottom right, John Locke. In two treatises on government, one of Locke's major works, and in other publications, Locke consistently argued against authoritarianism and for a limited government whose power was tightly circumscribed by law. In treatises, Locke summed up his basic approach to government as follows. He said, quote, "The end of law is not to abolish or restrain, but to preserve and enlarge freedom. For in all the states of created beings capable of law, where there is no law, there is no freedom." I'll read that again. The end of law, by the way, when he used the word law, he meant law and the government that makes the law. So literally, the purpose of government is not to abolish or restrain, but to preserve and enlarge freedom. The purpose of government is to make us free. For in all the states of created beings capable of law, where there is no law, there is no freedom. Then there's Scotland. In Scotland, the major figures of the Enlightenment were probably David Hume and also Adam Smith. Now, Hume was another one of those polymaths. He was a guy who was very learned in a lot of different disciplines. He was a philosopher, a historian, an economist, a celebrated essayist. During his lifetime, he gained a great deal of fame for his multi-volume History of Great Britain. But he's probably best known today as a philosophical empiricist. He's one of the founding fathers of the philosophical school of empiricism, which basically holds that all human knowledge ultimately derives from experience and observation. Smith was an economist, and he is widely considered to be the father of modern capitalism. Smith argued that in all economic interactions, an invisible hand governs most human behavior. And that invisible hand is basically the free market. And he argued that government should let the free market function on its own with a minimal degree of taxation and regulation, because that is what will produce the most economic benefit for the greatest number of people. Again, that's according to Adam Smith. So As with any intellectual movement, Enlightenment thinkers were very diverse in their perspectives about any number of issues. Somebody like John Locke, for example, would probably have disagreed with Voltaire, who disparaged democracy, hobnobbed with aristocrats and kings. I mentioned that he lived for a while as the personal house guest of Frederick the Great. And Voltaire also believed that a strong monarchy was necessary to implement the kind of rational societal reforms that he encouraged. But both Voltaire and Rousseau, by the way, were proponents of what was called absolute enlightened despotism or enlightened absolutism, where basically you have a philosopher king. You have a king who governs according to the principles of the Enlightenment. Somebody like John Locke would have said that was basically abstruse and impractical, and that in all likelihood the king would not end up being the ideal philosopher king that somebody like Rousseau or Voltaire hoped for. But these differences aside, it is possible to identify some general characteristics of Enlightenment thought, which was shared by most of the philosophers, most of the thinkers and writers associated with the Enlightenment. The first major characteristic of Enlightenment thought is faith in reason. And it's probably the one that is most universal among writers and thinkers associated with the Enlightenment. Enlightenment thinkers had a profound faith in the ability of human reason to understand all aspects of the natural world and human behavior. Faith in reason included the belief that through reason we could arrive at solutions for pretty much any human problem, like poverty, homelessness, joblessness, etc. Then there's anti-authoritarianism. Enlightenment thinkers differed in the degree to which they were anti-authoritarian. Voltaire, as I mentioned before, got along pretty well with many aristocrats and kings, but they were all critical of unlimited power. They also differed mainly in what kinds of authorities they criticized. Some focused their criticism on the state. Some, like Voltaire, for example, would have focused a lot of his criticism on the church, and so on. But they all tended to be critics of unlimited power. The French philosopher Denis Diderot probably expressed this anti-authoritarian attitude when he predicted that, quote, man will never be free until the last king is strangled with the entrails of the last priest. Hard to get more anti-authoritarian than that. And then the third major characteristic of Enlightenment thought is anti-clericalism, which basically means they were anti-religion, or especially anti-organized religion. And likewise, Enlightenment thinkers differed in the degree to which they were anti-clerical or anti-religion. Some actually got along reasonably well with religious authorities. Adam Smith, for example, had a very cordial relationship with his native Scottish Presbyterian church because the church in Scotland supported schools and universities and was relatively friendly to Scottish intellectuals. On the whole, however, Enlightenment thinkers were critical of organized religion, religious authorities, and especially religious intolerance of any kind. For this reason, many Enlightenment thinkers embraced a religious philosophy known as deism. Basically, deism was the belief system that held that God created the world, so they believe in a creator God. God created the world and the natural laws by which it operates, but after setting the world in motion, God ceased interfering in creation. For this reason, deism is also sometimes referred to as the blind clockmaker religion, because it describes a deity that is distant and basically uninterested in his creation, not terribly concerned with what is going on in it. So that's the Enlightenment in Europe. what about the Enlightenment when it comes to America? What did the Enlightenment look like when it arrived on these shores? Well, compared to Europe, the North American colonies were fairly late in participating in the Enlightenment. The movement really didn't reach America until the mid-18th century, and it only came to America by chance, mainly because a small cadre of American intellectuals, notably people like Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and John Adams, among others, kept up a regular correspondence with leading Enlightenment thinkers. Men like these were a part of what was loosely called a Republic of Letters, which was basically a community consisting of literate, well-educated men, they were overwhelmingly men, living in several countries on either side of the Atlantic, who shared ideas with one another through the exchange of books, essays, and especially personal correspondence, i.e. letters. This is why it's called the Republic of Letters. And so this community, they kept each other informed about events going on in their respective countries, also about discoveries they'd made through their own personal research and writing, and so on. And when I say Republic of Letters, the letters that they wrote to one another were really more extended essays than like a 1 or 2 paragraph email that you might send to your friend. We're talking about 20, 30, 40, 50 pages in length. And many of these letters were, in fact, intended for publication. Like, for example, Thomas Jefferson, right here. The only book Thomas Jefferson ever published was a book called Notes on Virginia, which began as a series of letters that he wrote to a friend of his in Europe, which were later compiled and published under the title Notes on Virginia. So there's that as an example. So what you have in America then is kind of the Enlightenment light. The new ideas from Europe have a significant impact on a small group of well-educated, influential men, and through these men, they have an impact on the American Revolution and on the founding of the American Republic. But they don't really percolate down below this level. They have a lot of influence up here, but the average ordinary tavern keeper or farmer in Massachusetts or Georgia probably wouldn't have heard very much, if anything, about somebody like Voltaire or Rousseau or Adam Smith and so on. The American Enlightenment also didn't follow the European pattern in at least 2 other areas. First, it was not nearly as anti-clerical or anti-religious. This is largely because the church in America didn't have as much power as it did in Europe, especially not as much political power or as much coercive power over people's lives, and so it wasn't really regarded as being much of a threat. Also, the Enlightenment in America wasn't nearly as anti-authoritarian. Most of the men influenced by the new ideas were, after all, elite, upper-class men, and they certainly didn't have much of an interest in critiquing their own authority. The most significant impact of the Enlightenment was that it caused many of its adherents in America to begin thinking about how to create a rational and just system of government if they got the chance to do so. And what they eventually came up with was a political philosophy called republicanism. Right? Republicanism. Republicanism is one of those terms that gets applied to something after the fact. The people, the founding fathers were influenced by the Enlightenment. They didn't necessarily call their belief system by any one term, but subsequently historians have used this term republicanism to refer to a broad system or a broad collection of political beliefs that most people had come to share in the 13 English colonies in North America by the time of the American Revolution. And so basically, there are four major tenets or four major principles of this ideology of republicanism that really leads to the American Revolution. The first is a balance between liberty and power. Um, the men who led the revolutionary movement in America believed that a working society needed a government, and governments, to function properly, must have power. But citizens must also have liberty. The goal of political leaders in a Republican society should therefore be to create a balance between the power of the government and the liberty of its citizens. By the late 18th century, many Americans believed that under British rule, the government had become far too powerful. People's liberty had become endangered by their government, and something needed to be done to correct that imbalance. Second major principle of republicanism is popular sovereignty. In order for a government to have legitimate authority, its power must rest upon the consent of the people. In a republican society, therefore, government must represent the people. Consent would normally be expressed in a republican context through voting and elections. Republican thinkers in America believed that for this reason, the British Parliament could not possibly represent the colonies because no one in the colonies voted for any member of Parliament. Very simple, right? Um, which is also, by the way, one of the reasons why one of the most popular political slogans of the revolutionary period is no taxation without representation. If you don't represent us, basically you don't have the right to tax us or take our money. Then there's an independent citizenry. For a Republican society to function properly, its citizens had to be independent. And in the context of the 18th century, they were referring to economic independence, which usually meant owning property, land, or some other type of revenue-generating property. Republican thinkers believed that owning land made citizens more virtuous and trustworthy because nobody could tell you how to vote. You were beholden to no one. You had the ability to support yourself and your family regardless of anything else. Now, just as an aside, this is also why at the state level, voting was initially tied to property ownership. When the republic was first founded, the state governments in each of the 13 states almost uniformly tied voting requirements to property ownership. So that if you weren't a property owner, you couldn't vote. And that was just the gist of it. All right, and then the last major component of republicanism is civic virtue. In order for a republican society to function properly, its citizens must have civic virtue. Basically, civic virtue means honesty, trustworthiness, thrift, a willingness to work hard, and a willingness to put the interests of your country ahead of your own narrow, personal self-interests. That's the type of civic virtue that leadership of the revolutionary movement hoped that their citizens would possess, because without it, they did not foresee the republic being able to survive for very long.